The story begins with a remark that jolted the political world. A candidate for the highest office in the United States dismissed a captured soldier by questioning whether heroism can coexist with failure. It was a moment that revealed something essential about him. He did not play by the etiquette of politics. He did not follow the unwritten rules that had governed American public life for generations. While previous candidates tried to appear restrained or diplomatic, he spoke freely, cut sharply, and ignored the kind of boundaries most contenders considered mandatory. Welcome to Political Plot, where we cut through the noise to reveal the power plays shaping American politics. Today we're diving into how a growing psychological worldview that prioritizes order, stability, and strong leaders helped reshape American politics and created the perfect conditions for a figure like Donald Trump to rise. In other words, we're exploring why a shift in authoritarian-minded voters changed not just one election, but the future of the political landscape. What disturbed many people was not only his tone, but what it implied. He challenged core democratic norms and often did so openly. Critics argued that he displayed a lack of respect for institutional guardrails, the very things that help keep a diverse nation stable. Others warned that he proposed ideas that flirted with discrimination, like screening people by religious identity before allowing them into the country. For many Americans, it felt unreal that someone using this approach could become a frontrunner for a major political party. Political analysts and commentators, who had spent decades predicting elections using familiar patterns, were caught off guard. Many laughed at the idea that he could lead the party's ticket. They underestimated both the changing political landscape and the psychological forces that were powering his rise. Underneath the surprise lay a question that demanded a deeper explanation. Why did he attract such wide support within his party? And what did that support reveal about the United States beyond that election year? The surprising answer came from a specialized field within political science, one that examines how people respond to social change and uncertainty. These scholars had developed a framework for understanding a worldview often labeled authoritarianism. The term here does not refer to dictatorships or military juntas. It is used to describe a psychological leaning toward order, stability, uniformity, and a suspicion of outsiders or unfamiliar social trends. People who hold this mindset prefer a world that feels structured and predictable. When they sense that society is drifting into chaos or that unfamiliar groups are gaining influence, they instinctively look for leaders who present themselves as strong figures capable of restoring control. When individuals with this worldview feel threatened, their preferences shift dramatically. They gravitate toward leaders who promise decisive action, who speak simply and directly, and who show little hesitation about punishing perceived wrongdoers. These leaders typically emphasize strength over diplomacy, toughness over nuance, and boldness over caution. If one were to design a candidate who appealed to this mindset, someone with blunt speech, unapologetic promises of force, and a willingness to challenge established norms, that candidate would resemble the one who dominated headlines in 2016. This worldview is not inherently tied to a single political party. Throughout much of American history, people with authoritarian personalities were spread across both major parties. That eventually changed. Over time, one party began adopting rhetoric that aligned with traditional values and resistance to rapid cultural shifts. After initially supporting civil rights legislation, that party shifted its strategy and appealed to Southern white voters who opposed racial integration. It later opposed measures such as the Equal Rights Amendment, criticized abortion rights, and fought against the legalization of same-sex marriage. As foreign threats emerged, especially terrorism, positions emphasizing strong defense and suspicion of outsiders fit neatly with authoritarian preferences. Political scientists Mark Hetherington and Jonathan Weiler documented this realignment through decades of data. They observed that people who strongly preferred social order began clustering within the Republican Party. As society changed rapidly, these voters became increasingly activated by issues tied to identity, national security, and cultural stability. Once activated, they formed a powerful and unavoidable force within the party. In other words, the party could not ignore them, and when a candidate arrived who spoke directly to their fears and aspirations, they responded with enthusiasm. However, identifying authoritarian voters is not easy. Researchers cannot simply ask whether people fear change or feel uneasy about racial differences because many would hesitate to answer honestly. Instead, scholars use indirect questions about parenting. They present choices like whether a child should value independence or respect for elders, whether obedience is more important than self-reliance. These questions seem to be about child rearing, but they measure something deeper, a preference for social hierarchy and order. When researchers compared answers to these questions with behaviors known to correlate with authoritarian tendencies, the match was striking. The results were especially predictive among white voters. Using this method, a large poll conducted with Morning Consult revealed several notable patterns. First, those who scored high on the authoritarian scale overwhelmingly preferred the candidate whose rhetoric appealed to strength and punishment. Other studies reached the same conclusion. In fact, authoritarianism appeared to predict support for him more strongly than age, income, education, or even party identification. Researchers also examined what authoritarian-leaning voters fear most. Interestingly, they were not significantly more afraid of impersonal dangers like car accidents or prescription drugs. But when the threats involved people, especially people perceived as foreign or unfamiliar, their fear rose sharply. These voters were also more likely to endorse aggressive policy solutions, such as favoring military force over diplomacy and accepting surveillance or reduced civil liberties in exchange for security. What emerged was a portrait of a group whose priorities did not always match the traditional Republican establishment. They were not particularly focused on shrinking government or cutting social programs like Social Security. Their core motivation was not ideology in the economic sense, but stability, identity, and protection. They wanted firmness, simplicity, and reassurance. They wanted someone who promised to fix what felt out of control, and they were prepared to reward anyone who projected power in a way that resonated with them. This framework does not fully explain the rise of this candidate. Political scientists will continue to analyze the 2016 election for decades, but it does reveal that he benefited from a larger transformation in the United States, a transformation in which psychological orientation toward authority became aligned with one specific party. He was not merely a celebrity candidate with name recognition. He tapped into a deep and growing reservoir of voters who craved order amid rapid social change. This group is large, motivated, and persistent. This means that his emergence was not an accident. It was the consequence of long-term political sorting and cultural tension. And as long as society continues to produce uncertainty, and as long as one party continues to speak directly to the desires of authoritarian-leaning voters, figures like him will continue to appear. He may have been the first of his kind to rise so visibly in modern American politics, but he is unlikely to be the last.